There's a moment that happens when the house is quiet and the phone hasn't buzzed in days. No plans, no obligations, no one expecting anything. And instead of loneliness, there's something else. A kind of relief so deep it almost feels like breathing again. Most people never understand this. They see someone who stopped reaching out, stopped showing up, stopped trying to maintain connections that felt more like performance than presence. And they assume something is wrong. But there's something deeper happening here. These aren't people who gave up on connection. They're people who spent years, sometimes decades, trying to fit into a social rhythm that never felt natural. They showed up, they smiled, they played the part, and slowly, quietly, they realized something unbearable. The cost of pretending was higher than the cost of being alone. Schopenhauer once said that solitude is the fortress of the strong, but he wasn't talking about physical strength. He was talking about the kind of strength it takes to stop performing your own life, to choose peace over applause, to safeguard the quiet truth inside you, the one that says not all connection is nourishing and not all solitude is empty. And if you've felt this, what comes next will change how you see yourself. Let me tell you about someone I knew years ago. She was in her late 50s, worked in an office for 3 decades, had colleagues she'd known for years, went to birthday lunches, smiled through happy hours, replied to group texts about weekend plans she never actually wanted to attend. And one day, she just stopped. Not dramatically, not with announcements or explanations. She just quietly let the invitations go unanswered, let the group chats fade, let the connections that required constant maintenance dissolve. People noticed, of course. They asked if she was okay, if something had happened, if she was depressed. But she wasn't depressed. She was relieved. For the first time in decades, she could come home and not feel like she owed anyone her energy. She could sit in her living room with her dog and a book and feel something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the peace that comes from solving a problem. The peace that comes from finally admitting the problem was never yours to solve. The interesting part is that this shift doesn't announce itself. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not a sudden awakening or a dramatic realization. It's a slow accumulation of moments where you realize that the energy you're spending to maintain certain connections is draining something essential inside you. You start to notice the relief you feel when plans get cancelled, the quiet joy that comes from an empty weekend, the way your body relaxes when you know you don't have to perform for anyone, and then comes the guilt, because society tells you that connection is everything, that isolation is dangerous, that people who prefer their own company are somehow broken or damaged or afraid. But what if that's not true? What if the people who stop forcing connection aren't running away from something? They're running toward something, toward clarity, toward authenticity, toward a life that doesn't require constant translation. Schopenhauer understood this in a way most philosophers didn't. He saw that sensitivity wasn't weakness. It was a kind of perceptiveness that made shallow interaction unbearable. He wrote about how certain people experience the world with more intensity, how noise feels louder, how superficial conversation feels like sandpaper on the soul, how being around people who don't understand you can be more isolating than being alone. And he didn't see this as a flaw. He saw it as a different way of being human, a way that requires more space, more silence, more time to process and integrate, and simply exist without the constant demand to be on. For these people, small talk isn't just boring, it's exhausting. Not because they're arrogant or antisocial, but because their minds crave substance, and the friction of meaningless chatter feels like a waste of the limited time we have. This is why a dinner party can feel more isolating than an empty house, because in a crowded room, you're surrounded by noise but starved of connection. At home, in the quiet, there's at least honesty. Pay attention to this part. When someone stops forcing connection after years of trying, they're not giving up on people. They're giving up on pretending. They're giving up on the version of themselves that smiled through exhaustion, that said yes when they meant no, that showed up to events they dreaded because they thought that's what good people do. And what they're choosing instead isn't loneliness. It's discernment. They're choosing to save their energy for the few connections that feel real, the ones that don't require performance or translation, the ones where silence is comfortable and presence is enough. This is what people on the outside never understand. They see withdrawal, they see isolation, they see someone who's given up on life. But internally, it's the opposite. Internally, it's the first time in years that life feels manageable. The first time the noise stops. The first time there's enough space to hear your own thoughts without the constant static of other people's expectations. There's something Schopenhauer said about this that stays with me. He wrote that a person who has a rich inner world has less need for the constant distraction of society. Think of it this way. If your inner house is empty, you need guests to make it feel alive. But if your inner house is full of ideas, memories, curiosities, and peace, then guests can sometimes feel like an intrusion. This isn't about superiority, it's about capacity. Some people recharge from the outside in. They need noise, movement, people. Their energy flows outward and returns through interaction, but others recharge from the inside out. They need quiet, stillness, solitude. Their energy flows inward and depletes when forced outward for too long. And for decades, the second group has been told they're doing it wrong. They've been told to put themselves out there, to get out of their comfort zone, to stop being so isolated. But what if the real problem isn't their need for space? It's a world that refuses to make room for it. I want to talk to you now, not about you. If you're someone who's stopped forcing connection, you already know what I'm describing. You've felt the relief. You've felt the guilt. You've wondered if there's something wrong with you for preferring your own company to the company of people who don't really see you. And I want you to know, there's nothing wrong with you. You're not broken. You're not damaged. You're not afraid of intimacy or connection or love. You're just someone who's learned, is often through painful trial and error, that not all connection is created equal, that some relationships drain more than they give, that some social obligations are just performances in disguise. And you've made a choice that takes more courage than most people realize. You've chosen to stop pretending, to stop performing, to stop forcing yourself into spaces that don't feel like home. This quiet shift is happening all over the world. People in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, people who spent decades trying to fit into a social mold that never quite worked, are finally giving themselves permission to step back. And they're discovering something unexpected. Solitude isn't the punishment they were taught to fear. It's the sanctuary they've been searching for. Before we continue, I want to invite you into this quiet corner of the internet. This channel exists for people like you, people who've spent years trying to explain why they feel different, why they need more space, why connection sometimes feels like work instead of joy. If this resonates, join us here. Share in the comments what part of this spoke to you most, because what comes next builds on everything we've just explored. Let's go a little deeper. There's a paradox at the heart of this experience, and it's one that Schopenhauer spent his life trying to articulate. The paradox is this: the people who need the most space are often the ones who feel connection most deeply. They're not cold, they're not indifferent, they're not incapable of love or intimacy or vulnerability. They're the opposite. They feel everything with an intensity that makes casual interaction exhausting. They pick up on subtleties that others miss. They carry the emotional weight of conversations long after they're over. And because of this, they need more time alone. Not to avoid people, but to process the depth of what they experience when they're with people. This is what makes the guilt so painful, because they're not choosing solitude out of apathy. They're choosing it out of self-preservation. They're choosing it because the alternative, constant performance, constant translation, constant management of other people's expectations, is simply unsustainable. There's something else that happens when you finally stop forcing connection. You start to notice how much energy you were spending just to maintain the appearance of a social life. How much mental space was consumed by obligations you never wanted. How much of your week was structured around events that left you feeling more drained than fulfilled. And when that weight lifts, when you finally give yourself permission to let it go, something remarkable happens. You don't become bitter. You don't become cold. You don't lose your capacity for love. If anything, you become more capable of those things. Because you're no longer wasting your energy on relationships that don't fit. You're no longer performing a version of yourself that isn't real. You're finally free to show up fully in the few connections that matter. To be present without pretending. To love without exhausting yourself in the process. Here's what that clarity looks like in practice. It's the ability to distinguish between loneliness and solitude, between isolation that harms and space that heals. It's the recognition that you can love people deeply and still need distance from them, that you can value connection and still choose to limit it. It's the understanding that your energy is finite, that every interaction has a cost, and that you're allowed to be selective about where you spend that energy. This isn't selfishness, it's stewardship. It's taking responsibility for your own well-being instead of outsourcing it to social expectations that were never designed with you in mind. There's a reason this shift often happens later in life. It's not that younger people don't feel this way. Many do. But it takes time to accumulate enough evidence to trust your own experience over what you've been taught. It takes years of showing up to events that drain you. Years of maintaining friendships that feel one-sided. Years of pretending to enjoy things you don't enjoy because that's what you think you're supposed to do. And eventually, the weight of all that pretending becomes unbearable. Eventually, you reach a point where the cost of maintaining the performance is higher than the cost of letting it go. And that's when the shift happens. Not because you've given up, but because you've finally learned to listen to what your body and mind have been trying to tell you all along. That you're allowed to live differently. That you're allowed to need different things. That you're allowed to choose peace over approval. Let me be clear about something. This isn't about rejecting all connection. It's not about becoming a hermit or cutting everyone out of your life. It's about discernment. It's about recognizing that not all connection is nourishing, that some relationships give more than they take, and that you're allowed to prioritize the ones that feel real. For many people, this means having 1 or 2 deep friendships instead of a dozen surface-level ones. It means choosing quality over quantity, depth over breadth. It means being okay with the fact that your social circle is small, that you don't have plans every weekend, that your phone doesn't buzz constantly with messages and invitations, because what you have instead is something more valuable: connections that don't require performance, relationships where you can be yourself without translation, spaces where your presence is enough. There's a line from Rilke that captures this perfectly. He wrote, "I want to be with those who know secret things or else alone." That's the essence of what we're talking about here. It's not that these people hate connection, it's that they've learned to recognize the difference between connection that nourishes and connection that depletes. And they've made a choice, often after years of trying to force the latter, to only accept the former. This is what Schopenhauer meant by the fortress of the strong. Not that solitude makes you strong, but that it takes strength to choose solitude in a world that constantly tells you it's wrong. It takes strength to trust your own experience over social conditioning. To honor your needs, even when they don't match what's expected. To build a life that feels true, even if it looks different from everyone else's. So where does this leave you? If you're someone who's stopped forcing connection, you're probably still navigating the tension between relief and guilt, between the peace you feel in solitude and the fear that maybe you're doing something wrong. And I want to offer you a different way of seeing this. What if the guilt isn't evidence that you're broken? What if it's just the residue of a lifetime of conditioning that told you connection should always feel good, that solitude is always dangerous, that needing space means something is wrong with you? What if the relief you feel, that deep, bone-level relief when you're finally alone, is actually your body telling you the truth? That this is what you need, that this is what feels right, that this is how you're meant to live, not forever, not in isolation, but in a rhythm that honors your actual capacity instead of forcing you into a mold that was never designed for you. Here's the thing about people who stop forcing connection after years of trying. They don't become bitter. They don't become cold. They don't lose their capacity for love or intimacy or vulnerability. If anything, they become more capable of those things, because they're no longer wasting their energy on relationships that don't fit. They're no longer performing a version of themselves that isn't real. They're finally free to show up fully in the few connections that matter, to be present without pretending, to love without exhausting themselves in the process. And that's not isolation, that's wisdom. It's the wisdom that comes from finally understanding that your energy is precious, that your peace is worth protecting, that you're allowed to build a life that feels sustainable instead of constantly draining. I think about that woman I mentioned earlier, the one who quietly let her social obligations fade. The last time I saw her, she looked different, lighter somehow, like she'd been carrying something heavy for years and finally set it down. She told me she didn't miss the life she used to have, the constant plans, the group texts, the birthday lunches with people she barely knew. What she missed, she said, was the version of herself who thought she needed all of that to be okay. But she didn't need it. She never did, and neither do you. If this feels familiar, if you've spent years trying to force yourself into a social rhythm that never quite fit, I want you to know that what you're feeling isn't wrong. The relief when plans cancel, the peace when you're alone, the exhaustion that comes from too much interaction, the guilt that follows the relief, all of it is valid, all of it makes sense, and none of it means you're broken. It just means you're someone who needs more space, more quiet, more time to exist without the constant demand to perform. And that's not a flaw, it's a difference, one that deserves to be honored instead of pathologized. But here's what most people never talk about. Once you stop forcing connection, once you give yourself permission to live at your own pace, a new question emerges. What do you do with all that space? How do you fill the hours that used to be consumed by social obligations? How do you build a life that feels meaningful when it doesn't look like everyone else's? Because solitude can be a sanctuary, but it can also become a trap if you don't know how to inhabit it intentionally. And that's what we need to explore next. Not just why you need space, but how to use that space to build something real, something that feels like home instead of hiding. Because the difference between solitude that heals and isolation that harms isn't about how much time you spend alone. It's about what you do with that time, and whether you're choosing it consciously or just defaulting to it out of fear. That's the conversation we're going to have in the next video. Because if you've made it this far, you're ready for it. A quiet corner of the internet for people who choose solitude over half-hearted connections.